Tonight, we're going to explore something you have almost certainly experienced in the last 24 hours. Something so familiar that you may never have stopped to ask why it happens at all. You settle in. The room goes dark. You pull the covers up, let your body grow still, and close your eyes. And that is when it begins. Not silence, not rest, noise. Not the noise of the world outside, not traffic, not voices, not the hum of electricity in the walls. The noise that arrives now is yours. It belongs entirely to you, and it has been waiting all day for exactly this moment. The moment you stopped. Maybe it begins with something small, a conversation you had this morning, one sentence you wish you could take back. Replaying now with perfect precision in the theater of your mind. Or perhaps it is something larger that arrives. The weight of a decision you haven't made yet, hovering over you in the dark like a question with no easy answer. Or it might be something stranger than either of those. A memory from years ago, something you hadn't thought about in months. Surfacing now with no warning and no clear reason, vivid and oddly detailed, as though your mind reached into some deep drawer and pulled it out to examine it under the quiet lamp of your attention. And sometimes all three arrive at once. The practical worry and the old memory and the emotional residue of a moment 3 days ago that you thought you had already let go of. All of them gathering in the room with you, sitting down uninvited on the edge of the bed. If you've ever wondered why this happens, why the very act of trying to rest seems to summon every unresolved thought you've ever owned, then you are in exactly the right place tonight. I'm so glad you're here, because what you experience in those quiet minutes before sleep is not a failure. It is not anxiety that has simply escaped its container. It is not a sign of a troubled mind or a broken brain or a particularly difficult life. What happens in the dark, when the world grows quiet and your thoughts grow loud, is one of the most fascinating and least understood phenomena in all of neuroscience. And in the next hour, we are going to trace it together, slowly, gently, all the way to its origin. You might assume this is a modern problem, a symptom of phones and notifications and the perpetual acceleration of the 21st century. You might assume that earlier, simpler humans fell into sleep as easily as rain falls into a lake. But they didn't. The ancient Romans wrote about it. The medieval monks cataloged it. The great thinkers of every era have sat awake in the dark and felt exactly what you feel now. The loud mind at bedtime is not new. It is not a malfunction. It is something far more interesting than either of those things. So tonight, as you settle in, let yourself be curious rather than frustrated. Let yourself wonder. Because the question itself, why does the quiet make thoughts louder, turns out to reach deep into the architecture of your brain, into the chemistry of consciousness, into the evolutionary history of what it means to be a mind lying in the dark. We'll begin gently. We'll move slowly. There is no rush. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through the science of the mind, please consider liking this video. It helps more curious people find their way here, and it means more of these conversations can happen. And now, let's begin by looking not at the bedroom and not at the brain, but at everything that happened before you got here. At the world you moved through today. At the noise that kept you company from the moment you woke until the moment you lay down. Because the answer to why your thoughts feel louder at night begins, perhaps surprisingly, with what was keeping them quiet all along. To understand this, we need to start not with silence, but with the extraordinary, constant, relentless sound of being awake in the world. Phase 2, context building, 2 to 6, approximately 3,300 words, Chapter 2, the world that keeps you distracted. Think about your day, not the important parts, not the decisions or the milestones or the things you'll remember. Think about the texture of it. The grain. You woke to an alarm or to light, and almost immediately the world began filling you. Maybe a phone screen with its soft, insistent glow. Maybe the sound of someone moving in another room. Maybe the ambient rush of traffic outside, the smell of coffee, the particular feeling of cool air on your face before you fully committed to being awake. The world, from the first moment, arrived with texture and noise and sensation and task. You got dressed. There were decisions in that, small ones, automatic, barely noticed. You ate or you didn't. You moved through your morning with a kind of practical momentum that has no room in it for the kind of open-ended wondering that the night brings. The day is too full for that. The day is structured, sequenced, purposeful, even when it doesn't feel like it. Even on a quiet day, a lazy Sunday, a slow afternoon in which nothing much happens, the world is still present, still occupying you, still offering you things to look at, sounds to process, sensations to interpret. If you've ever wondered why you don't tend to lie on a park bench in the middle of the afternoon, overwhelmed by intrusive memories and unresolved worries, the answer is not that you are more mentally stable at 2 in the afternoon than you are at midnight. The answer is that at 2 in the afternoon, the world is doing something for you that you don't even notice it doing. It is keeping your mind busy. It is filling what would otherwise be empty space with content. It is providing the cognitive equivalent of background music, and that music, even when it is entirely unconscious, performs a remarkable function. Think about the office worker sitting through a meeting she didn't particularly need to attend. On the surface, she may appear distracted. Her mind may wander. She may think about lunch, or about the email she needs to send, or about the odd comment her colleague made last Thursday. And yet, crucially, she is not thinking about the argument with her sister from last month. She is not reliving the moment of embarrassment from 3 years ago. She is not cycling through the financial worry she has been carrying for weeks. Those things exist. They are present in her mind, in her memory, in her emotional body. But the meeting, the low-level, mildly boring, ambient presence of other people and information, is holding them at bay, gently, without effort, simply by being there. Or consider the university student walking across campus between lectures, headphones in, music playing, the physical rhythm of movement engaging parts of the nervous system that want to be engaged. The world is arriving in layers: sound, visual field, the sensation of cold air, the social awareness of being among other people. None of this requires much effort. It is almost entirely automatic. But it is occupying bandwidth that would otherwise be available for the kind of inward spiral that the night permits. Or think about the parent moving through the afternoon hours with children. The constant low-level demands, the negotiations, the noise, the physical proximity of small people with large feelings. The mental load here is significant, and it is easy to imagine such a person looking forward to the quiet of midnight as a kind of reprieve, and they might be right to look forward to it. But what no one warns them about, what no one warned any of us, is that the quiet, when it finally arrives, is not empty. It never was. For centuries, people have described this experience in the language available to them, which is often the language of metaphor and complaint. My mind will not let me rest. I cannot stop the thoughts. The worries come at night. These phrases exist in literature and in letters and in diaries across cultures and across millennia. And what is striking about them is not their variety, but their consistency. The human experience of lying down in the dark and having the mind refuse to follow is essentially universal, which means it is not a personality type, not a modern affliction, not a thing that happens only to the anxious or the troubled. It happens to all of us. And that universality is a clue, because the things that happen to all humans consistently across all conditions and all eras are almost always the result of something structural, something in the architecture, something the brain is doing not by mistake, but by design. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let me hold that thread for a moment and take you somewhere else first, somewhere older. Chapter 3. For centuries, the night was feared. For centuries, and this is not hyperbole, but a measurable historical truth, the experience of lying awake with an active mind at night was understood almost entirely through a non-scientific lens. That lens varied by culture and era, but it was remarkably consistent in one thing. It attributed the busy nighttime mind to something outside the sleeper, rather than something within them. In ancient Rome, the experience of lying awake with unwanted thoughts was commonly attributed to the activities of the lemures, restless spirits, often the unburied or unavenged dead, who were said to move through the night and disturb the sleep of the living. The Roman festival of Lemuria, held each May, was specifically designed to appease these nocturnal spirits and restore the peace of the house. Families would wake at midnight and walk through their homes throwing black beans over their shoulders, a ritual intended to feed and pacify the spirits and persuade them to leave. What is quietly remarkable about this tradition is that it was trying to solve a real problem, the problem of the active mind at night, using the tools of its era. The beans were not going to change the neurochemistry of the thalamus, but the ritual itself, the walking, the purposeful physical engagement, the repetitive action, may well have helped some of the participants drift towards sleep simply by giving the anxious mind a task to perform, a container for its energy. The medieval Christian tradition handled the matter differently, but arrived at similar territory. The Benedictine monks who slept in dormitories and were woken at midnight for the office of vigils, a liturgical hour of prayer in the deep of night, left behind a remarkable body of written testimony about the experience of the nighttime mind. In their theological framework, the unbidden thoughts that arrived in the darkness were not neurological events, but spiritual ones. They called them logismoi, a Greek word meaning roughly thought demons, and their entire contemplative tradition developed an extensive practice for dealing with them. The Desert Fathers of the 3rd and 4th centuries wrote about these thoughts with a precision and sophistication that is, at times, neurologically prescient. They described thoughts that came uninvited, that attached themselves to attention, that grew stronger when you tried to fight them, that often contained nothing morally significant at all, just memories, images, small anxieties, fragments of conversation. They prescribed for these thoughts, a technique of gentle acknowledgement rather than forceful suppression. A recommendation that contemporary cognitive neuroscience would find, centuries later, to have been essentially correct. In the Renaissance, a more secular but equally vivid literature of nighttime thinking emerges. Michel de Montaigne, writing his essays in the 16th century, described the nighttime mind with something that sounds almost like wry affection. The mind, he observed, was never more active, never more capriciously itself than in the dark hours before sleep. His essays are in some ways a product of these nighttime thoughts. Long, wandering, associative, filled with tangents and memories and observations that connect to each other by strange internal logic, rather than by any conventional structure. Montaigne understood, without the vocabulary of neuroscience, that the nighttime mind operates differently than the daytime one, that it is more associative, more personal, more likely to surface the things we have been quietly carrying. Blaise Pascal, in the 17th century, gave us one of the earliest and most elegant descriptions of what we might now call cognitive pre-sleep arousal. In the Pensées, he wrote, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." He was thinking of boredom and restlessness and the human flight from self-encounter, but he had identified something real. The room, the quiet, the stillness, these are not neutral conditions. They are, for the human mind, profoundly activating. They present the mind with itself, unmediated. And the mind, it turns out, has a great deal to say. By the 19th century, the medical tradition had begun to document what we might recognize as insomnia, the inability to initiate or maintain sleep. The Victorians, with their characteristic blend of scientific aspiration and moral concern, categorized it largely as a disorder of the will or the nerves, and railway spine, nervous exhaustion, brain fever. The language of the era betrayed a genuine confusion about the line between the psychological and the physiological, between what the mind was doing and what the body was doing. But the experience being documented is familiar, the busy mind at night, the thoughts that refused to stop. Freud arrived at the turn of the 20th century and offered what seemed for a moment like a comprehensive explanation. The nighttime mind, in Freudian theory, was the unconscious asserting itself. Dreams and pre-sleep thoughts were coded messages from repressed desires, wishes that the waking mind had refused to acknowledge. The interpretation was alluring. It gave the nighttime mind meaning, narrative, direction. But it also, in a certain important way, mischaracterized what was happening. By locating the cause entirely in the personal unconscious, in hidden wishes and forbidden desires, Freud missed the structural, neurological, evolutionary explanation that the science of the following century would slowly uncover. And this is where the real story begins. Not with spirits, not with sin, not with repression, but with the structure of the brain itself, and what happens to that structure in the quiet hours. This raises another question, and it is a fascinating one. If centuries of human thought have circled this phenomenon, attributing it to everything from demons to the unconscious, might the actual explanation be stranger and more beautiful than any of those accounts? Might the loudness of your nighttime thoughts have a purpose that you never suspected? We are about to find out. Phase 3. First partial answer, 6 to 12. Approximately 5,000 words. Chapter 4. The noise that was protecting you. The reason is, in its first layer, almost absurdly simple. The world is noisy, and you are a noisy world animal. Throughout the day, throughout every waking hour, your brain is processing an astonishing quantity of sensory information. This is not a figure of speech. At any given moment during your waking life, your visual system is processing millions of bits of information from your retinal field. Your auditory system is constantly parsing the acoustic environment, detecting edges of sound, separating signal from noise, identifying voices, registering distance and direction and emotional tone. Your proprioceptive system is continuously updating your brain's map of where your body is in space. Your skin is reporting temperature and pressure and texture. Your olfactory system is cataloging the chemical signatures of your environment. And all of this vast incoming tide of sensory data is being filtered, prioritized, compressed, and interpreted by a nervous system that has been doing this work without a single deliberate instruction from you. This processing, this constant, automatic, largely unconscious sensory management, does something that is not immediately obvious, but turns out to be one of the most important things it does. It competes. It competes with your internal thoughts for the limited processing resources of the brain. This is the central insight of what researchers call perceptual load theory, a framework developed by psychologist Nili Lavie in the mid-1990s and elaborated since by decades of experimental work. The core idea is elegant. The brain has a finite capacity for conscious processing at any given moment. When the external world is demanding enough of that capacity, when the perceptual load is high, there is simply less capacity available for internally generated content. Your worries, your memories, your ruminations, your emotional residues, they don't disappear, but they are crowded out. They are held in a kind of waiting room just outside conscious awareness, prevented from entering the main stage by the sheer volume of the show already playing. When the external world goes quiet, when the lights dim, when the sounds recede, when the physical demands of the body reduce to almost nothing, the perceptual load drops. The waiting room empties into the auditorium, and everything that was waiting, everything that the day had been keeping at bay, arrives at once. The reason your thoughts feel louder at night is not in this first layer of explanation, that they have become louder. It is that the noise that was drowning them out has gone away. Think of it this way. Imagine sitting in a restaurant with a radio playing in the background. The radio is playing music, perhaps a song you vaguely recognize, something soft and familiar. But you can't quite make out the words. The conversation at your table, the clatter of plates, the hum of other voices, the ambient acoustic texture of the room, all of it is more immediately demanding than the radio. The radio recedes into the background. You are not unaware of it. If someone asks you whether music is playing, you can confirm that it is. But you are not consciously processing it, not engaging with its content, not registering its emotional meaning. Now the restaurant empties, the conversations end, the plates are cleared. The ambient noise drops away, and suddenly the radio is audible. Not because the volume has changed, but because everything competing with it is gone. The song that was always playing is now the most prominent thing in the room. This is what happens when you lie down. The radio was always playing. The thoughts were always there. The perceptual load theory says that you simply couldn't hear them clearly until now. But this explanation, while true as far as it goes, is only the first layer. Because if perceptual load were the whole story, then thoughts would arrive at bedtime at the same volume and emotional intensity as they were present during the day, simply more audible, like the radio in the empty restaurant. And that is not quite what happens, is it? The thoughts don't just become audible. They seem to become more intense, more persistent, more emotionally charged. They acquire a weight at midnight that they did not have at noon. To understand why, to understand what else is happening beyond the simple reduction in external noise, we need to go one layer deeper, into a part of your brain that is always working, always thinking, always weaving the story of who you are. A network that the neuroscience of the early 21st century discovered almost by accident. And that changed everything we thought we understood about what the resting brain was doing. Chapter 5. The Brain's Background Program. In the late 1990s, a neurologist at Washington University named Marcus Rachel was puzzling over something unusual in his brain imaging data. He had been running what seemed like a straightforward experiment, comparing brain activity in subjects who were performing a cognitively demanding task with brain activity in subjects who were simply resting, doing nothing in particular, lying still with their eyes closed. The assumption going into the experiment was standard. The task condition would produce brain activation, specific regions lighting up in response to the task demands. And the rest condition would produce relatively flat activity, a kind of neural baseline, a brain idling. But the data said something else entirely. The resting brain was not idling. It was not quiet. It was, in some measurable and reproducible sense, extremely active. Active in a specific, coherent, internally organized set of regions that included the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the angular gyrus, and the hippocampus. These regions were not random. They were a network, consistently the same network, consistently active in the same coordinated pattern whenever a person was not engaged in a demanding external task. Rachel called this the default mode network. The name is deliberately humble. It describes a network that is on by default, active in the absence of task engagement. But the name undersells the discovery, because what Rachel had found was not a passive idling system, but an active, purposeful one. A network that, when left to itself, does something quite specific. It thinks about you. Not you in the sense of your body's physical state, that is managed by other systems. The default mode network thinks about you in the narrative sense. It thinks about your past, replaying memories, recontextualizing events, reassessing how things went. It thinks about your future, simulating scenarios, anticipating difficulties, preparing responses to situations that haven't happened yet. It thinks about other people, imagining their mental states, rehearsing social interactions, evaluating relationships. It thinks about who you are, processing identity, values, self-concept, the story you tell yourself about your own life. This is not trivial work. It is, in a very real sense, the most personal and most continuous work the brain performs. The default mode network is the part of you that is always, quietly, mulling everything over. The second scenario is the insomniac's central tragedy. Someone who has difficulty sleeping becomes aware, over time, that they sometimes cannot sleep. This awareness, this knowledge that they might not sleep, becomes its own cognitive content. They lie down at night with a monitoring process that is not just watching for forbidden daytime worries, but also watching for evidence that sleep is not coming, that the familiar pattern of sleeplessness is recurring. They monitor for the absence of sleep. They check their thoughts to see if they are the kind of thoughts that indicate they will sleep. They assess their physical state for signs of the relaxation that would suggest sleep is approaching. Each of these monitoring actions activates the concept of sleeplessness, which is the thought they most want to avoid, which the monitoring process brings into awareness, which triggers the operating process to redirect, which uses resources, which depletes executive function, which makes the operating process less effective, which makes the monitoring more dominant. The loop tightens with each cycle. The thoughts become louder with each attempt to quiet them. The third scenario is perhaps the most subtle and the most universal. You are lying in the dark, and a thought you find boring or irrelevant arrives. Something mundane, a grocery list, an administrative task you need to complete. Something so ordinary, it seems not worth the attention of the sleeping mind. And you try, gently, to set it aside. I'll think about that tomorrow. You reach for sleep, turn your attention toward the kind of calm blankness you imagine sleep approaching from. And the monitoring process, faithful and automated, scans for the mundane thought, finds it, presents it again. You redirect. The monitor scans, the thought arrives, redirect, arrives, redirect, arrives. For thoughts that carry no emotional weight, no urgency, no significance of any kind, this cycle is somehow especially maddening because there seems to be no reason for the thought to be persistent. And yet it is. And yet, the persistence is exactly what the science would predict. There is a finding from the research of Dr. Allison Harvey at the University of California, Berkeley, that crystallizes the cognitive pre-sleep arousal picture beautifully. Harvey and her colleagues have spent years studying what happens in the minds of people who lie awake at night. Not people with diagnosed anxiety disorders or clinical insomnia necessarily, but ordinary people on ordinary nights when sleep was slow in coming. What they found, consistently, was a specific pattern of mental activity that they termed cognitive arousal, an elevation in the volume and emotional tone of pre-sleep thinking that was distinct from daytime cognitive activity, not just in content, but in quality. The nighttime thinking was more ruminative, more focused on self-referential material, more prone to cycles of return and re-examination. It was, in a measurable sense, more stuck. And the stickiness, Harvey's research suggested, was not random. It was correlated with two factors: the subjective importance of the thoughts themselves and the degree to which the sleeper was trying to manage or control their thinking. The more someone tried to direct their pre-sleep mental state, to steer it toward the calm blankness they associated with falling asleep, the more cognitively activated they became. The more they tried to sleep, the more awake they were. There is a thought experiment worth sitting with here, one that I find genuinely clarifying. Imagine that you could divide yourself into two observers, running simultaneously. Observer 1 is you at noon on a Tuesday. Caffeinated, alert, norepinephrine at healthy levels, prefrontal cortex running in full top-down mode, sensory environment providing healthy perceptual load. Observer 2 is you at 1 a.m., tired, in the dark, thalamic gating reduced, DMN unrestrained, norepinephrine dropping, amygdala relatively unchecked, hippocampus replaying emotional highlights. Both observers receive exactly the same piece of information. The presentation next week might not go as well as you hope. Observer 1 processes this, notes it, applies the realistic probability estimate, considers what can be done about it, reaches a proportionate level of mild concern, files it. Observer 2 receives the same information, and something entirely different happens. The amygdala flags it immediately. Threat, potential humiliation, social danger. The hippocampus begins mining its archive. Memories of past presentations that went poorly. Memories of the feelings associated with social judgment. Memories of times when preparation wasn't enough. The prefrontal cortex tries to apply the realistic evaluation. It will probably be fine. You've done this before. But it is running on reduced norepinephrine, and the modulating signal doesn't fully land. The simulation begins. What if this? What if that? What if the whole thing falls apart and everyone sees? The monitoring process checks for signs of calm. Calm is not found. The cycle continues. The same fact, the same person, different brain chemistry, different experience. Why did evolution produce a mind that becomes cognitively active at precisely the moment of rest? Why would natural selection preserve a feature, the loud, ruminative, emotionally engaged nighttime mind, that seems, on the face of it, to interfere with sleep? Sleep is itself a profound biological necessity, and anything that consistently disrupts it should, all else being equal, reduce survival. So why does the nighttime mind exist in the form it does? The answer, as several evolutionary psychologists and sleep researchers have proposed, is that the nighttime review was not a disruption of survival. It was one of the mechanisms of it. Consider the environment of our evolutionary ancestors. The period stretching from Homo erectus through Homo sapiens, in which the neural architecture that underlies our sleep and our thinking was largely established. These were small social groups, navigating complex physical environments and even more complex social ones. The challenges were real and immediate: finding food, avoiding predators, managing relationships within the group, anticipating threats, planning for the coming season. The costs of a bad decision, or of failing to anticipate a threat, could be existential. For such a mind, in such conditions, the hours of darkness had a particular function. The day had been full of events, encounters, close calls, social negotiations, successful and unsuccessful strategies, emotional signals from other members of the group. All of this data needed to be processed, evaluated, and integrated into the ongoing model of the world that the brain uses to navigate the future. And the quiet of night, when the demands of the external environment were lowest, when the physical world made no claims on attention, was the ideal time for this processing. The pre-sleep rumination that we experience as disruptive was, in this evolutionary frame, a cognitive workspace, a time for reviewing the social interactions of the day and adjusting one's model of relationships, a time for replaying near misses and updating threat assessments, a time for simulating tomorrow's challenges and preparing strategic responses, a time, in short, for the kind of deep, effortful, emotionally engaged thinking that was not available during the day. when sensory demands were too high and task demands were too immediate for extended inward reflection. The anthropologist Matthew Walker and others who have written about sleep from an evolutionary perspective have noted that even the specific content of typical nighttime thinking, social relationships, unresolved conflicts, potential future challenges, emotional assessments of past events, maps almost perfectly onto the categories of information that would have been most survival relevant for a social primate navigating a complex world. The nighttime mind was not thinking about irrelevant things. It was thinking about precisely the things that mattered most. There is even an argument to be made about the social dimension of nighttime thinking. In small group living, the maintenance of social bonds and the management of social conflict are among the highest priorities of individual survival. The brain's tendency to replay social interactions at night, to review conversations, to reconsider what was said and how it was received, to anticipate how a social situation might evolve, was directly serving this priority. The nighttime mind was, among other things, a social maintenance system, working through the interpersonal materials of the day, updating the internal model of relationships, preparing for the social negotiations of tomorrow. This evolutionary perspective does not make the loud nighttime mind less challenging to live with. The ancestral environment for which this system was designed was very different from the modern bedroom. Our ancestors were processing the events of a life lived in small groups, in intimate contact with the natural world, with a relatively narrow scope of social and practical concerns. The modern mind is asked to process an almost incomprehensible volume of social information, digital as well as in person, global as well as local, extending across networks that have no evolutionary parallel, and to do so in an environment that provides far less of the natural signal structure that the ancestral mind used to organize this processing. We have the same pre-sleep processing system that our ancestors had. We are running it on a much more complicated input. But the system itself, the nighttime review, the emotional replay, the prospective simulation, the social rehearsal, was not a design failure. It was a design feature, a feature that was present in our earliest ancestors, that has been refined across millions of years of social living, and that continues to operate in us today with the same purpose and the same basic mechanism. In the dark of a room that is safer than any shelter our ancestors ever slept in, reviewing a world that is larger and more complex than any they ever navigated. The thoughts are loud because the review was always supposed to be thorough. The mind is active at night because the night was always supposed to be when the mind did its deepest work. Phase 5. Integration, 45 minutes to 55 minutes. Approximately 8,300 words. Chapter 6. The symphony playing in the dark, 45 minutes to 50 minutes. So we see that the loudness of the nighttime mind is not one thing. It was never one thing. Let us stand back now, at this moment that is both late in the evening and deep in the science, and look at what we have built. We have assembled, layer by layer, a picture of extraordinary complexity. A picture of a brain doing many things simultaneously, most of them invisibly, most of them purposefully, all of them converging in the dark bedroom on the experience of a mind that will not be quiet. Layer 1, perceptual load. During your waking hours, the world provides a constant supply of sensory input, that competes with internal thought for the brain's limited processing resources. The thoughts, the worries, the memories, the emotional fragments are not absent during the day. They are crowded out. The bedtime arrival of thoughts is, in its first and most basic dimension, simply the arrival of what was always there, now made audible by the removal of the covering noise. The restaurant has emptied. The radio was always playing. Layer 2, the default mode network. The moment external tasks end, the brain's most personal cognitive system activates. The network that thinks about you, that reviews your past and simulates your future, and assesses your relationships and maintains the narrative of who you are. This network was suppressed during the day's task demands. When you lie down and the tasks end, it assumes the foreground with all the confidence of a program that has been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. Layer 3, the thalamic gatekeeper. The thalamus, which filters and manages what reaches conscious awareness, begins its transition to sleep mode before you are asleep. It starts closing its gates on external input while the cortex is still awake. This creates the gap, the window of conscious experience in which the external world is being progressively filtered out while the internal world is still running at full capacity. You lose the filter before you lose the thoughts. Layer 4, the ironic process. The natural response to unwanted thoughts at bedtime. The effort to suppress, redirect, manage, control creates the very cognitive machinery that makes the thoughts more persistent. The monitoring process that checks for the presence of the unwanted thought keeps the thought activated. The harder you try not to think, the more you think. The midnight mind grows louder in direct proportion to the effort applied to quieting it. Layer 5, hippocampal replay and emotional memory prioritization. The hippocampus, performing its essential memory consolidation function, replays the day's emotionally significant events in the pre-sleep period. This replay arrives when the cortex is quiet enough to receive it clearly, and the memories arrive not just as information, but as emotionally charged material, updated by the current neurochemical state of the resting brain. Layer 6, norepinephrine's retirement. The locus coeruleus, the brain's primary norepinephrine source, reduces its activity as sleep approaches, taking with it the neurochemical support for the prefrontal cortex's emotional regulation function. The amygdala becomes relatively more reactive. Emotional calibration weakens. Things feel larger, heavier, more urgent in the dark, because the system that keeps them in realistic proportion during the day has begun its nighttime retreat. Layer 7, the theta threshold. The hypnagogic state, the passage between wakefulness and sleep, marked by the emergence of theta waves, is the natural endpoint of all this nocturnal processing. The thoughts don't get solved or silenced. They get metabolized. They dissolve into the associative, image-based logic of the dreaming brain, which processes them in its own language, in its own time, and returns to the morning a mind that has, in its sleep, done work that waking consciousness could not. Layer 8, the evolutionary purpose. The entire system was designed for this. The night review, the emotional replaying, the social processing, the perspective simulation, is not a glitch in the code. It is a feature that has been present in the human mind for as long as humans have lain down in the dark and closed their eyes. It was serving survival long before it was keeping anyone awake. and it continues to serve the processing needs of a complex social intelligence even when it frustrates those needs host. Now look at what happens when you put these 8 layers together and view them not as separate mechanisms, but as a single, integrated event. You lie down. The perceptual load drops, layer 1. The default mode network activates, layer 2. The thalamus begins its pre-sleep transitions, layer 3. The thoughts of the day arrive, the emotional residues, the unresolved concerns, the social memories. You notice them. You want to sleep. You try, with some degree of effort, to not be thinking. Layer 4. The hippocampus is running its evening replay, layer 5, selecting the most emotionally significant content. The norepinephrine has begun to fall, layer 6, making that content more emotionally intense and harder to regulate. The brain is slowly approaching the theta threshold, layer 7, where all of this will eventually dissolve. And underneath all of it, the ancient function that started this whole biological sequence, the evolutionary pre-sleep review, layer 8, is running exactly as it was always designed to run. You are not failing to sleep. You are not broken. You are not uniquely anxious or uniquely troubled. You are a human mind at night, doing what human minds at night have always done. The symphony is playing. Every instrument has a part. Every mechanism is doing precisely what it was built to do. The fact that the music is sometimes difficult to rest through, that it is sometimes so present and so demanding that sleep retreats before it, is a function of the extraordinary complexity of the system and of the extraordinary complexity of the world it is trying to process. There is a thought experiment I want to offer here that I find, personally, quite moving. Imagine taking every thought that will arrive in the next hour as you lie in the dark. Every worry, every memory, every half-formed plan, every emotional residue, and putting it into a physical container. A box, say. Now imagine that box sitting somewhere in the room, present, real, tangible. It is not empty. It is full of the day's unprocessed material. The conversations and near misses and social negotiations and small griefs and small joys and large questions and medium-sized concerns of a life being lived. Now imagine that every night, while you sleep, a system that has been operating in your nervous system since long before you were born takes that box and does something extraordinary with it. It sorts through the contents. It evaluates what is important and what is noise. It updates the emotional weight of the significant items. It runs simulations. It weaves connections between items that seemed unrelated by day. It compresses what can be compressed, expands what needs to be examined more carefully, and files everything in a structure of long-term memory that will, when you wake, have made the world a little more navigable. The thoughts that feel loud tonight are not problems. They are the contents of the box, briefly visible, on their way into the system that will process them in the dark. The loudness is the beginning of the work, not the failure of it. And this understanding changes something about how you might receive the nighttime mind. Not trying to stop it, not trying to force it into silence, but allowing it gently to do what it came to do. The thoughts are not invaders, they are materials. The brain is not misfiring, it is preparing. Chapter 7. The message in the loudness. 50 minutes to 55 minutes. In this way, the question we began with, why does the quiet make thoughts louder, reveals itself to be not just a question about sleep, but a question about consciousness itself, about the nature of the mind, about what it means to be aware. Because the phenomenon we have been tracing all night, the amplification of internal experience in the absence of external input, is, at a deeper level, a statement about the relationship between the mind and the world. The mind is not a passive receiver. It does not simply process what the world delivers and fall silent when the world goes quiet. The mind is generative. It is always producing, always running its models, always reviewing its archive, always simulating its futures, always maintaining the narrative of the self. This production never fully stops. It is, in a sense, what a mind is. What changes between day and night is not the mind's activity, but the visibility of that activity. During the day, the production is mostly hidden, masked by the sensory demands of the world, suppressed by task engagement, drowned out by the perceptual noise of being present in a complex environment. The mind's inner life runs in the background, influencing everything but visible in very little. And then the day ends. The world goes quiet. The masks come off, and there it is. The mind, doing what it always does, but now visible in a way that the busy day did not permit. This is not a small thing. There is something philosophically significant about the fact that most people know their own mind best not in the activity of the day, but in the quiet of the night. It is in those pre-sleep hours that we encounter our actual emotional state, not the one we have been performing or managing or navigating through, but the one that was present all along, beneath the noise. The worry we thought we had handled, the longing we thought we had set aside, the grief that found no appointment in the schedule of the day. They are all here in the dark, with their true measure intact. The French philosopher Gaston Bachelard, writing in 1958 in his extraordinary work, The Poetics of Space, observed that the house at night becomes something different from the house in daylight. That darkness makes intimate spaces more intimate. That the withdrawn self in a darkened room has access to depths of experience that the socially engaged, externally oriented daytime self does not. Bachelard was writing as a phenomenologist, not a neuroscientist, but his description maps with remarkable precision onto what we have been tracing in the brain. The night, in his account, creates conditions for a particular quality of encounter with one's own inner life. An encounter that is more direct, more honest, more unmediated by the social and practical demands that structure the day. This encounter can be uncomfortable. The thoughts that arrive in the dark are not always the ones we would choose to think about. The memories that the hippocampus prioritizes for replay are not always the ones we would prefer to revisit. The emotional weight that the low norepinephrine, hyper-aroused amygdala assigns to the contents of the night is not always proportionate or fair. The nighttime mind, for all its purposefulness, is not a kind or a flattering mirror. It shows what is there, not what we might wish were there. And yet there is something valuable in this showing, even when, especially when, it is difficult. The person who cannot sleep because their mind keeps returning to a difficult relationship is being informed by their brain that the relationship matters to them, that it carries weight, that it is unresolved, that their internal model of the situation has not yet reached a stable state. The person whose mind circles back night after night to a professional worry or a creative frustration is being told in the most honest language available, that this thing is important to them, that it occupies their deepest cognitive concern. The person who lies awake with a grief that seems to re-amplify in the dark is experiencing a process of emotional consolidation that the hippocampus is conducting with the care and thoroughness that the importance of the material demands. None of this makes the experience easy, but it makes it meaningful. And meaning, even when it is uncomfortable, is not nothing. It is, in fact, quite a lot. There is a contemplative tradition found in various forms across Buddhist practice, in certain Christian mystical traditions, in the Stoic approach to the evening review, that has understood this for a very long time. The practice of the examination of conscience in Jesuit spirituality, for instance, is specifically a pre-sleep practice, a deliberate, structured review of the day's events, examining one's emotional responses, one's decisions, one's interactions with others. It is, in essence, a voluntary version of exactly what the hippocampus is trying to do automatically. By making the review conscious and intentional, the Jesuit practitioner is working with the nighttime mind's natural function rather than against it. The Buddhist practice of pre-sleep meditation, specifically, the practice of lying down and observing thoughts as they arise, without engaging with them, without following their threads, simply watching them appear and pass, is similarly aligned with the neuroscience. It does not attempt to eliminate the pre-sleep cognitive activity. It changes the relationship to it. It removes the ironic process by removing the effortful suppression. The monitoring process that Wegener described, the automatic system that keeps the unwanted thought activated in order to detect it, loses its function when you are not trying to suppress the thought in the first place. The thoughts are allowed to arrive. They are seen. They are not fought. And in many people, in many conditions, this allowing, this change in relationship, results in a more peaceful transition to sleep than any amount of active mental management. This is not to say that clinical sleep difficulties, genuine, persistent insomnia, sleep disorders, anxiety disorders that manifest at night, are solved by philosophical reframing. They are not, and I am not suggesting that they are. The hyperarousal model and the ironic process and all of the other mechanisms we have discussed create real and sometimes serious difficulties that benefit from real and sometimes structured interventions, from cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia to careful medical assessment. The science of the nighttime mind is, in this respect, important not just as a curiosity, but as a clinical framework that has helped many people find relief from genuine suffering. But for the ordinary person on an ordinary night, the person lying in the dark with thoughts that feel louder than they expected, wondering what is happening and whether it is normal and whether it will ever stop. The science offers something specific and something kind, a complete explanation that removes the shame from the experience. The loudness is not a sign of weakness. It is not evidence of a troubled character. It is the sound of a brain doing its deepest and most necessary work, under conditions that have been precisely engineered by millions of years of evolution to produce exactly this sound. The room is quiet. The thoughts are loud. And now you know why. Phase 6. Gentle close, 55 minutes to 60 minutes. Approximately 4,200 words. Chapter 8. What you know now, 55 minutes to 58 minutes. In the end, The question we came with tonight, why does the quiet make thoughts louder, was never really about why the quiet fails. It was about why the mind succeeds, about the extraordinary, patient, purposeful work that the brain performs every single night, without fanfare, without instruction, in the dark and the stillness that most of us experience as simply the time before sleep. You know now that the thoughts that arrive in the bedtime hours are not invaders. They are contents, the day's unprocessed materials, the emotional archive of a life being lived, the hippocampus's prioritized replay, the default mode network's continuation of its endless, intimate, self-referential work. They arrive because the noise that was covering them has gone away. They feel intense because the neurochemical systems that moderate their intensity have begun their nighttime retreat. They persist because the very act of trying to quiet them activates the mechanism that keeps them present. And they will, when the time comes, dissolve not into silence, but into the associative, symbolic language of dreams, where the brain continues in its sleep to process and consolidate and integrate the very content that kept you awake. There is, I think, something quietly extraordinary about this. The mind that lies awake in the dark, the mind that seems to be failing at the simple task of resting, is not failing at all. It is in the middle of something. It is engaged in the most personal and most continuous project the brain undertakes. The maintenance of a self, the processing of a life, the preparation for a future that it cannot know but must simulate. The loudness is not evidence of malfunction. It is evidence of function, of a system doing its work with the same diligence and the same care that it has always brought to the task. There is a quality to nighttime thinking that daytime thinking lacks. A specific texture that you may have noticed in your own experience. The thoughts that arrive in the dark are more honest somehow, more direct. They have not been curated for a social audience, have not been shaped by the practical demands of the day, have not been edited by the performance of competence or calm or pleasantness that the social world often requires. They are you in the dark, with your actual emotional state, with the things that actually matter to you, with the fears that are real fears, and the longings that are genuine longings, and the unresolved questions that are genuinely unresolved. The French philosopher Pascal wrote that all of humanity's problems stemmed from the inability to sit quietly in a room alone. He was, in his characteristically Pascalian way, identifying a difficulty and labeling it a failure of the will. But perhaps the inability to sit quietly in a room alone is not a failure. Perhaps it is a property, an expression of the nature of the mind, which is never, at any moment in its waking life, truly quiet, and which is doing something important with its noise. When you understand what the noise is, when you can trace it back through the layers we have covered tonight, back to the perceptual load that was covering it, back to the thalamic gating that is now releasing it, back to the hippocampal replay that is generating it, back to the norepinephrine chemistry that is intensifying it, back to the evolutionary purpose that created it, the noise becomes something else. It becomes information. It becomes the sounds of a process. And processes, even complex ones, even ones that keep you awake sometimes, are not frightening things. They are ordinary things. They are natural things. They are the texture of being alive. You have, over the past hour, looked at your own mind with some of the finest tools that neuroscience has yet produced. You have seen, in some detail, why it does what it does in the dark. And I genuinely hope, that this seeing has been in some small way a comfort, not a resolution, not a cure, but a context, a frame, a quiet understanding that what you experience at night is something you share in all its essential character with every human being who has ever lain down in the dark, with the Roman who threw his black beans, with the medieval monk who wrote down his Logismoi, with Pascal in his room, unable to be quiet, with Edison and his ball bearings, with every person who has ever turned off the light and been surprised to find that the turning off of the light was not the same as the turning off of the mind. Chapter 9. Let it be loud, 58 minutes to 60 minutes. And so, as you settle in tonight, as the room goes dark and the sounds of the world begin their gentle retreat, perhaps you might try something different from the usual response to the arriving thoughts. Instead of reaching for the remote control of your own mind, instead of trying to redirect or suppress or manage the content of the pre-sleep hours, you might simply let it be there. Let the thoughts arrive. Let the hippocampus run its replay. Let the default mode network do its intimate, associative, self-referential work. Let the amygdala flag what it flags, and let the memory surface what it surfaces. Not because fighting the thoughts is wrong, not because there is a rule about how to lie in the dark, but because you know now, you understand, in some detail, and with some scientific grounding, that the thoughts are doing something, that the loudness is purposeful, that the process, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it keeps you awake a little longer than you wanted to be awake, is the beginning of something that will happen in the dark. The sorting, the consolidating, the weaving of the day's experience into the ongoing narrative of a life. Let it be loud, just for tonight. Let the thoughts have their moment. Watch them if you can, not with effort, not with the monitoring process engaged, not with an assessment of how long it has been and how many hours remain. Just watch them, the way you might watch clouds drift across a dark sky. This one about tomorrow's meeting. This one about the conversation from last week. This one, strange and unexpected, about something from 3 years ago that you had not thought about since. They are all here. They have all been waiting quietly on the other side of the day's noise. And now the day's noise has gone, and they have come through, and they are yours. They are the contents of a life that is being lived, being processed, being understood, night after night in the dark, by a brain that is doing something remarkable with nothing more than time and quiet. The thalamus is closing its gates, gently, one by one. The norepinephrine is settling toward its nighttime floor. The default mode network is already beginning its dreamward drift, its associations becoming softer and stranger and less coherent. The theta waves are gathering at the edges of your electrical field, and somewhere beyond them, not far now, not very far at all, is the sleeping mind that processes what the waking mind could not. The dreaming mind that speaks in symbol and story. The ancient continuity of consciousness that has been doing this work in the dark since long before we had any of the words we've used tonight to describe it. The thoughts will soften. They always do. The body is already resting. The breath is already slow. And the mind, your mind, is right where it is supposed to be. present, alive, attended to the day that is ending and the night that has just begun. Sleep well. Drift gently. Let the quiet do its work.